What do you do when your car dies in the middle of nowhere, and you're not alone? In the early hours of an ordinary autumn morning in Denmark, a young man on his way to work is caught off guard when he spots a soft yellow light that hovers just above the ground. Beneath it, a ramp extends downward to the forest floor. Along the ramp, 7 small figures move quickly, mechanically, collecting something from the ground and passing it into the glow. But they're not alone. Nearby, other beings stand motionless, watching. And further down the road, another car waits, with its headlights flashing. Whether by chance or by arrangement, he knows not. But he feels they are watching, not fleeing. What happened next would stay hidden for over a decade. It would be 10 years before anyone outside the family heard a single word about what the young man saw that morning in Osum. But when the story finally reached the right ears, the investigation took off, and the details of that morning slowly came into focus. In the quiet farmland outside Osum, on the Danish island of Funen, something strange happened in the early 1980s. The exact year is uncertain, either 1981 or 1982. But it would be more than a decade before the story came to light. When it finally did in 1996, the investigation was led by Erling Hegelund, one of Denmark's most notable UFO researchers. With him was Toke Haunstrup, a younger but already dedicated field worker who had begun studying sightings when he was just 14. An early autumn morning, a man who in this account will be known as PN was on his way to work at a warehouse belonging to the Danish Consumers Cooperative Society in Odense. He was scheduled to start at 2:30 a.m. Around 2:10 a.m., he was driving his Fiat 125 through the small town of Osum, about 4 kilometers east of Odense. Osum is a small village with scattered buildings. The town is built around a small beech forest, which is enclosed by 3 roads. The forest is 150 meters on each side. The young man was cruising down Snedkerstræde, a road that runs alongside the forested area. Snedkerstræde goes up a small hill before it connects with Osum Main Street. At this intersection, PN usually turned left to drive toward Odense. Just as PN reached the low rise on Snedkerstræde, right before the T-junction, the car suddenly stalled. However, since the road slopes down toward Osum Main Street, the car continued to roll forward. When PN reached the T-junction, he brought the car to a stop and at that moment noticed a strange object. To the right on Osum Main Street, at a distance of about 60 meters, a light phenomenon was hovering partly over the road and partly above the forest floor. The object appeared to be floating about 1 to 2 meters above the ground, stood approximately 3 meters tall, and was circular in shape. However, PN had difficulty seeing the precise form of the object because it emitted a strong light that illuminated the surroundings with a yellowish glow. It looked like a ramp extended from the craft down to the forest floor. The ground there lies a couple of meters below the level of the road. The ramp was as wide as the object itself. Where the ramp connected to the luminous structure, there appeared to be a large opening leading into its interior. PN had difficulty seeing details, and the inside looked like an orange cloud. Along with the object, PN saw 2 groups of beings. One group consisted of 7 small creatures that were running up and down the ramp. Their movement was quick and so continuous that it reminded PN of something mechanical. He had the impression that the beings were picking something up from the forest floor and handing it to someone inside the cabin. In addition to these small beings, PN saw another group, consisting of 3 slightly larger individuals. 2 of them stood at the top of the ramp near the entrance, and the third stood at the base of the ramp. They were holding some kind of instrument or similar object. PN perceived this second group of beings as guardians. They stood motionless throughout the entire observation. The beings were about 1 meter tall and had a light gray appearance. They looked like 2 triangles placed on top of each other. A small triangle at the top formed the head, with a larger one beneath it corresponding to the body. The guardians were slightly taller than the other beings. PN does not recall seeing any arms on the beings. The legs were just small stiff stumps sticking out at the bottom. They floated above the ground. The leg stumps did not move. After watching the beings in shock for nearly a minute, PN looked in the opposite direction along Osum Main Street and spotted a taxi parked 150 meters away, on the slope leading down to the river valley near Osum. The taxi driver was flashing the headlights repeatedly. PN does not know whether this was meant as a signal to him or to the beings. At this moment, PN managed to start the engine. At the same time, it looked as if the beings had noticed him. They began moving toward him at high speed. Immediately after that, the taxi turned around and drove back toward Odense. Frightened, the young man drove as fast as he could, turning left onto Osum Main Street, away from the object and toward Odense, down into the river valley. When he had climbed back up from the valley, he looked in the rearview mirror and saw that the beings had reached the bottom of the valley and were now on the middle of the bridge across the stream. At that point, PN was about 150 meters from the T-junction. Meanwhile, the beings had moved roughly 140 meters from where the object had been, down toward the stream. After that, the road curved, and as a result, PN lost sight of them. PN remembers arriving at work earlier than usual, having sped through Odense. Later that same day, after finishing his shift, he went back to Osum to take a closer look at the spot where the object had been hovering. He found no trace of anything on the road or in the forest. When Scandinavian UFO Information first caught wind of the case in 1996, approximately 15 years after the fact, the chance of finding witnesses was quite small. Even so, they put out a call for the mentioned taxi driver in the local newspaper, but without success. Later, a report was compiled by Erling Hegelund and Toke Haunstrup, who among other things visited the site of the observation. On that occasion, we knocked on doors at a number of nearby residences. None of the residents could provide any information, and several of them had not even lived in Osum in the early 1980s. Erling and Toke write, "We learned about PN's observation through his mother. 1 to 2 years before PN's experience, she and her husband had an incident in which their car stalled and they saw a light in the sky. At the time, PN's father was worried the family would be labeled as crazy and forbade anyone from talking about what he and his wife had seen. When PN later had his own experience, he did not dare speak of it to anyone outside the family." At the time of the observation, PN was 21 or 22 years old. During the interview for the report, he said that the experience had affected him in various ways ever since. He has felt marked psychologically, and he believes he has gained certain extraordinary abilities. For example, he thinks he has developed the ability to predict events. He also says that since the experience, he has generally been unlucky and has been involved in several serious traffic accidents. He has not explained in detail how he believes these accidents might be connected to what he experienced. Before or after the incident, PN has never had any particular interest in UFOs. In their investigation, Erling and Toke conclude that there is no doubt PN himself believes he observed non-human intelligent beings. He also believes in the experience his parents had when their car stalled in 1980. A recurring question that Erling and Toke work with in their fieldwork is this one: can the observer's account be trusted? They write, "Our meeting with PN painted a picture of someone who was certainly not trying to fool us or make something up. Based on the personal encounter, we are convinced that PN truly experienced something which he himself firmly believes was caused by an external force. What is more interesting, however, is the question of whether what PN describes has a physical origin. In other words, did the events actually take place? Or is it more likely that PN had a psychological experience in which his own imagined images and ideas about UFOs triggered what he perceived? Since his observation, PN has had various psychological experiences and believes, among other things, that he has the ability to predict events. This could be a natural result of the psychological after effects that an extraordinary experience might bring. But it could also suggest that PN has a general tendency to have many such extraordinary experiences of psychological origin. If he is especially receptive to these kinds of experiences, that might also help explain what happened in Osum. It is also worth noting that PN's parents had an incident 1 to 2 years before PN's own experience, in which their car stalled and they observed a light in the sky. Their story may have influenced PN to a greater or lesser degree. As for the parents' experience, it should be said that it did not involve a particularly high degree of strangeness. For example, their account contains no clear indication that the engine failure was directly related to the light they observed. The light phenomenon in fact resembles, in several respects, the lighting patterns of an aircraft. It's worth noting that at the time of the investigation, this was already an event more than 15 years in the past. Therefore, it was perhaps difficult to recall details accurately after such a long time, and so-called memory distortions can occur. PN may have connected an unrelated memory, such as one from a science fiction film, to his own experience. It was also interesting that PN personified the beings as guardians and workers. In doing so, he interprets their actions, roles, and relationships to one another. The workers perform manual tasks, the workers are subordinate to the guardians, and so on. It is entirely natural to try to interpret and make sense of what one experiences. But from the field of perceptual psychology, the scientific discipline that studies how humans understand and interpret sensory input, we know that interpretation has a feedback effect on how the observer remembers the event. This means that PN's interpretation of the beings as workers and guardians may, over time, shape his own memory of the incident to align with that understanding. Erling and Toke noted that the situation resembled many they had encountered before, a case marked by a particularly high degree of strangeness, but with only a single witness. The crucial question, they wrote, was whether PN's description corresponded to an actual physical event. But as in so many other cases, no clear conclusion could be drawn. In the literature of close encounters, the Osum case occupies a familiar but uneasy place. A single witness. High strangeness. No corroborating evidence. No physical trace. The classic structure of a CE3, with all the interpretive challenges that come with it. The beings are described with precision. The movements, the light, the layout of the scene. And yet what we are left with is a certain form of data, a narrative recalled years after the event, shaped by memory, context, and the human need to make sense of what cannot be easily explained. The investigators, Erling Hegelund and Toke Haunstrup, approached the case with measured care. They did not claim to know what happened that morning in Osum, but they were clear on one point. The witness, known to us spectators only as PN, believed his experience was real. His account was detailed, consistent, and sincere, and it had marked him. In his book UFOs and Aliens, Questions and Possible Answers, Erling Hegelund reflects on patterns seen across many such cases. He writes, "When we study aliens' interactions with our planet, we get the impression that they have certain rules for their visit. We can imagine it takes place similarly to a scientific delegation on Earth. They must study without influencing the area. Whether that framing applies to what happened in Osum is hard to evaluate. But the comparison is worth sitting with. A kind of fieldwork conducted on us. Not overt, not hidden, just calibrated to leave as little behind as possible. In the end, the Osum encounter remains open. Not in the sense of ongoing investigation, but as a case that resists closure. It invites the kind of attention that serious ufology requires. Listening without assuming. Documenting without distorting. And above all, asking what it means to encounter the unknown, not only in ourselves, but in the world." Thank you for watching this week's episode. We'd like to give a warm welcome to our new channel members. Thank those of you who sent super thanks and coffees, and of course, a big thank you to our ongoing supporters. See you next week.